16 years. A lifetime spent in the shadows, waiting. Maggie, a German Shepherd, had given everything. Her loyalty, her love, her service. But in her old age, she was left behind, forgotten. And here she was, in a cold, gray shelter, looking out with tired eyes as the world passed her by. Her fur was graying. Her once proud stature now stooped from age. Her coat, thin and worn. Yet, despite the years of hardship, Maggie remained still, watching, waiting, hoping that someone would come and see her. But for months, no one did. People walked past her cage, eyes averted, only stopping to look at the younger, more energetic dogs. They didn't see her. To them, she was just another old dog, too old, too tired, too broken to give love. But what they didn't understand was that Maggie had so much to offer, if only someone would open their heart and see past the years on her face. She had been through so much already. Years of service, years of companionship, years of devotion. Yet, here she was, alone in a cage, waiting for a door to open. Her hope was fading, every day the same, but somewhere deep inside, Maggie still believed that maybe, just maybe, someone would see her. Her eyes weren't filled with anger or resentment. They were filled with quiet yearning. She had been through so much already, yet she still longed for one thing, a home. A place where she could rest in peace. But in the cold shelter, she had no hope. The years had drained it from her. Or so she thought. Maggie wasn't asking for a miracle. She wasn't pleading for attention. She wasn't barking for help. She was simply waiting. Waiting for the one person who might change everything. What does it take for a dog to be seen? What does it take for someone to notice the quiet, broken hearts among the noise? Sometimes, all it takes is one person. One person who will look past the age, the tired eyes, the fur worn thin, and see the love that's still there. The love that Maggie still had to give. But who would it be? Who would notice Maggie when all the world had walked by her? Who would give her a chance? And then, just as Maggie's hope was beginning to fade, a door opened. Not the shelter door, but the door to something far more unexpected. A new chance. The heavy shelter door creaked open, a gust of cold air sweeping in, carrying with it the faint sound of footsteps. Miss Evelyn stepped inside. She wasn't young, and she wasn't looking for just any dog. She wasn't looking for a puppy or a young, energetic dog to keep her company. No, Miss Evelyn was looking for something else, a companion who had been overlooked, a friend to share her days with. She had always had a soft spot for older dogs. But the moment her eyes landed on Maggie, something clicked. Maggie wasn't just any dog. Maggie wasn't just another soul lost in the cold, barking world of the shelter. Maggie was a kindred spirit, someone who had lived a lifetime of service, just waiting to be loved. Miss Evelyn didn't hesitate. She stopped. Her eyes softened, and she knelt down slowly. The world around her seemed to fade away. It was just her and Maggie. Maggie, who had waited for so long, locked eyes with the elderly woman. And for the first time in months, her tail gave a little twitch. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Miss Evelyn didn't need to ask why Maggie was still there. She didn't need to know about her history, or why no one had ever picked her before. All she knew was that Maggie was meant for her. But just as Miss Evelyn moved to speak, something unexpected happened. Maggie didn't lunge forward like she had with so many others who passed by her cage. She didn't bark in excitement. Instead, she pulled back, slowly, almost as though she was afraid of hope. Miss Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. Had Maggie given up? Or was it something else, something far deeper? Was Maggie afraid to trust? Had she been hurt so badly that she couldn't imagine a life outside the walls of the shelter? Or was it simply the fear of disappointment, the fear of yet another person walking away? Miss Evelyn paused, looking closely at Maggie, sensing the hesitation. She didn't rush. She didn't push. Instead, she slowly extended her hand, quietly offering Maggie the only thing she had left to give, her trust. And then something miraculous happened. Maggie, with a soft sigh, took a single step forward. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to change everything. Miss Evelyn gently opened the cage, And Maggie didn't back away. She didn't retreat. For the first time in her life, she stepped out of the cage. Maggie wasn't just walking into a new life. She was walking into something far more important. She was walking into the arms of someone who truly understood. Miss Evelyn didn't rush. She didn't speak too quickly. She simply stood, letting Maggie come to her. And when the German Shepherd finally approached, Miss Evelyn's arms were ready to receive her. For the first time in months, Maggie felt safe. She felt like she had a place. But just as Miss Evelyn was about to lead Maggie out of the shelter, something caught her eye. The shelter worker, watching from a distance, shook her head sadly. "You do realize, don't you?" the worker said softly, almost apologetically. "She's old. She's had a hard life. She might not have much time left. Are you sure you want to take on a dog that may not be around for long?" Miss Evelyn didn't flinch. She didn't back away. Instead, she smiled softly, her eyes meeting the workers with unwavering confidence. "Time doesn't matter," Miss Evelyn replied, her voice calm but resolute. "What matters is the love we give, no matter how much time is left." With that, she turned, leading Maggie out of the shelter, leaving behind the cold walls that had once been her prison, but had now become nothing more than a distant memory. Miss Evelyn's hand remained steady as she led Maggie out of the shelter. Each step echoed louder than the last, but it wasn't just the sound of footsteps that filled the air. It was the soft weight of hope. Maggie, who had waited 16 long years, was now walking toward a life that was hers. A life she'd never thought she'd see. And yet, as Maggie stepped across the threshold of the shelter, she didn't look back. Maybe, after all the years of waiting, she knew something had finally changed. Or maybe she was too tired to even remember what the shelter walls once felt like. Either way, she wasn't alone anymore. Home wasn't what Maggie expected. It wasn't grand, it wasn't flashy. It wasn't what most would think of when they imagined a new life. But for Maggie, it was everything. A warm bed, soft food, a place where she could rest. Finally, a place to call home. Miss Evelyn had seen enough in Maggie's eyes to know that she wouldn't need anything fancy. She didn't need toys or a yard to run in. Maggie just needed someone to share her time with, someone who would listen and care for her, just like she had cared for so many before. But just as Maggie began to settle into her new home, something unexpected happened. One night, as Miss Evelyn sat on the porch, sipping her tea, Maggie, who had been lying beside her, suddenly sat up. Her ears perked. Her nose twitched. She stared toward the road, a low growl rising from her throat. Miss Evelyn, puzzled, set her cup down. She had never seen Maggie react like this. It was as though she knew someone was coming, but Miss Evelyn couldn't see anything in the distance. No car. No footsteps. Just the sound of the wind. Miss Evelyn rose to her feet, instinctively moving toward Maggie, who was now pacing the porch. Something was off. Maggie had never behaved this way before. And then the knock came. It was sharp, urgent. A single knock on the door, breaking the silence of the night. Maggie froze, her body stiffening. The growl returned. A low rumble, but this time it wasn't fear, it was warning. Miss Evelyn stood still for a moment, listening to the knock. It wasn't just any knock. It was deliberate, as though someone was trying to send a message. She didn't open the door right away. Instead, she stood by the window, her heart racing. Who would be knocking at this hour? What did they want with her and Maggie? She turned, looking down at Maggie, who was now staring at the door with a mix of anxiety and something darker, recognition. Maggie had never reacted like this to a knock. She had never even barked at anyone before. So why now? Why tonight? Miss Evelyn opened the door, her hand shaking just slightly as she gripped the knob. What stood before her was a figure she didn't expect, a man in his mid-50s, well-dressed, with sharp eyes and a stern look on his face. He spoke without introduction, his voice low, carrying an air of authority. "I'm looking for Maggie." Miss Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. "Maggie, who are you?" she asked, her voice steady, though her mind raced. She had adopted Maggie only a few days ago. How could anyone be looking for her now? The man paused for a moment, his eyes flicking to Maggie, who had now retreated behind Miss Evelyn, her tail low, but her posture alert. Something was off about this encounter. I knew Maggie. She was once part of my team. Well, I was with her during her earlier years. I worked with her in the service. I just wanted to make sure she's okay. Miss Evelyn felt a chill run through her. This man didn't look like someone who worked with dogs. He looked like someone who worked with secrets. He was hiding something. And Maggie? She knew it. Why didn't you come for her sooner? Miss Evelyn's voice was calm, but there was something behind her words, defiance. She wasn't just taking any excuse. Maggie was no one's burden now. She was hers. The man's face softened just slightly, as though he knew he had been caught in something bigger than just a simple inquiry about an old dog. We had our reasons, he said, but his voice was shaky now, unsure. We didn't expect Maggie to survive this long. What was this man talking about? Maggie didn't belong to anyone now. She had a home, a life, a future. And then the twist, the bombshell. The man's eyes narrowed as he looked at Miss Evelyn. Maggie's previous handler. She wasn't supposed to make out. It was all arranged. I wasn't supposed to find her again. Miss Evelyn's world suddenly tilted. Maggie, who had been a loyal companion for so many years, had once been part of something much darker. This wasn't just about a dog who had been left behind. Maggie had been a part of a greater story, one that neither she nor Miss Evelyn could have ever known. How could Miss Evelyn know that the past Maggie had left behind was still chasing her even here? Was there more to Maggie's story than just? Miss Evelyn stood her ground, unwavering. Maggie wasn't just a dog to her. She was family. But the man in front of her, with his carefully controlled gaze, was a stark reminder of the past Maggie had left behind. You're not taking her back. Miss Evelyn's voice was firm. She didn't know the full story of Maggie's past, but she wasn't going to let anyone drag her back into the darkness from which she had just escaped. The man seemed to hesitate for just a moment, and then his eyes hardened, his jaw tightening. You don't understand, he said, his voice lowering. Maggie was more than just a companion. She was part of something much bigger than you could ever imagine. Maggie, who had been lying quietly by the door, suddenly stood up, her body tense. Was she remembering something? Something about this man? His presence stirred something in her, a deep, painful memory that Miss Evelyn couldn't yet understand. Miss Evelyn felt the weight of the moment. She had always known that Maggie had been through a lot in her life, but what was this man saying? What did he mean by something bigger? Before Miss Evelyn could speak, the man quickly continued, his words spilling out in a rush, almost as if he wanted to get them off his chest. Maggie was once part of an elite team, trained, tested, and sent into dangerous situations. His voice faltered slightly. She saved lives. But after that, the government couldn't let her live freely, so they left her to die in a shelter. The truth hit like a tidal wave. Maggie, her Maggie, had been a hero. She wasn't just any ordinary dog. She had been trained for something far darker than anyone could have known. She was meant to be disposed of, forgotten. The man's eyes grew harder. But she was never supposed to survive this long. She's too dangerous. Too much of a risk. Miss Evelyn recoiled. But there was something else too, compassion. Her heart broke for Maggie, who had been caught in the middle of something that wasn't her fault. She was a survivor, a true warrior. And now, this man wanted her back. Miss Evelyn turned to Maggie, who was staring at the man now, her body trembling, but her eyes were full of defiance. Maggie had already endured enough. She wasn't a tool to be used. She wasn't a weapon to be discarded. She was loved. She was home. You're not taking her, Miss Evelyn said again, her voice steady, her resolve unshakable. She deserves peace. And she deserves to be loved. That's the life she's going to have now. The man's face tightened, but he didn't argue. His shoulders slumped slightly, like the weight of his mission had been shattered. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled envelope, holding it out to Miss Evelyn. This is for her, he said. It's everything she was trained for. The documents that prove her value, her purpose. I thought you should have them, even if it means nothing now. Miss Evelyn didn't take the envelope right away. Her eyes stayed on the man, then flicked down to Maggie, who was still looking at her with those intense, knowing eyes. Maggie didn't want the past. Maggie wanted a future. Miss Evelyn's fingers brushed against the envelope, but she didn't take it. Instead, she looked back at the man and said with quiet conviction, "The only thing Maggie needs now is love. And that's all she will ever get from me." The man paused, and for the first time, Miss Evelyn saw the regret in his eyes. Maybe he had seen the light in Maggie's eyes too. Maybe he realized that the past, whatever it had been, was behind them both now. As the man turned to leave, he looked back one last time, his face shadowed by something Miss Evelyn couldn't name. He wasn't the enemy. Maggie's past, however, was far more complicated than either of them could have imagined. "Goodbye, Maggie," the man said softly, as though releasing a long-held breath. And with that, he disappeared into the night. Miss Evelyn closed the door behind her, Maggie standing beside her. Maggie's journey, it seemed, was far from over. The scars of her past might never fade, but they didn't have to define her future. Miss Evelyn placed the envelope on the table, then walked over to Maggie, kneeling beside her. She ran her fingers through Maggie's fur and whispered, "You don't need to fight anymore. You're home now." And Maggie, for the first time in so long, felt safe. No more missions. No more fear. No more darkness. Just love. Finally. As Miss Evelyn and Maggie sat together in the quiet of their home, they both knew Maggie had survived the impossible. She had found peace, not because she had been given a second chance, but because she had been chosen. The sun set quietly over the horizon, casting a warm golden light across the small home. Inside, Maggie lay peacefully at Miss Evelyn's feet, her tail gently twitching as she slept. For the first time in a long while, the world outside seemed distant, almost irrelevant. Here, in this quiet corner of the world, Maggie had finally found what she'd been searching for all along: peace. The past would always linger in the shadows, like a distant memory, but it no longer defined who Maggie was. She was no longer a tool. She was a dog. And in that moment, that was enough. She was safe. She was loved. And she had found her forever home. Miss Evelyn sat down beside Maggie, gently stroking her fur. As Maggie's eyes slowly opened, she met Miss Evelyn's gaze, a gaze full of understanding, a gaze that said, "I've been through so much, but now I'm home." In the quiet stillness of the room, Miss Evelyn whispered softly, "You are perfect, just as you are." And Maggie, as if hearing her, let out a small sigh, nestling closer, content. Some stories are filled with struggle, with pain, with loss. But Maggie's story was one of resilience, of finding hope in the darkest places. It wasn't about the past. It wasn't about what she had been through. It was about who she was now. And the bond that Miss Evelyn and Maggie shared, a bond built on trust, compassion, and love, proved that no matter the past, no matter how broken or lost we feel, there's always a second chance. Miss Evelyn had given Maggie something priceless, a future. Not because Maggie was perfect, but because Miss Evelyn knew what it meant to love without conditions. In a world that often overlooks the forgotten, she saw Maggie for who she truly was. That's what love is. It doesn't look at age. It doesn't count the years. It doesn't care about the scars or the past. Love simply sees. And in the end, that's all that matters. Maggie had fought for survival, but now she could finally rest. She had found a home where she was truly seen, where she was loved, cherished, and wanted just as she was. And Miss Evelyn? Well, she had found a friend, a companion, and in many ways, she had found a reflection of her own strength, her own perseverance, and her own heart. And that was enough. Every dog deserves a second chance. Every heart deserves to be opened. Will you give that second chance? If Maggie's story touched your heart, if you believe every dog deserves a home, please consider adopting a senior dog today. Share your story with us in the comments below, and don't forget to hit subscribe for more heartwarming, life-changing stories. Because sometimes it's not just the dog that gets saved. Sometimes they save us too.